Yeah, well, it's called The Land of the Well, which HarperCollins has brought out. It's my second novel. Briefly will be difficult because, as my friends will testify, I am a woman of many words, but I will try. It's about a young boy. He's 17 going on 18. He's excellent at studies, but he's hopeless at making friends. He's a kind of a dysfunctional young boy. He's on holiday in Goa in monsoon with his parents, which sounds almost torturous, but he puts up with it because he's a good boy. He's a good Indian boy. While he's there, he comes across a group of very attractive strangers, adults. They're all in their late 20s, early 30s. He finds them deeply attractive and also slightly dangerous. But the linchpin of that group, the attractiveness of that group, is a woman called Momo, for whom our protagonist falls madly in love. And he decides he has to stay back. And what happens to him after he takes this rather radical decision of not returning to Bombay with his parents, but staying on in Goa, and the ways in which he makes this rather desperate attempt to belong to that group and actually succeeds to an extent, and thereafter what happens, the kind of mind games that this slightly sinister bunch of adults play with him and the fallout of that encounter. That's what the book is about, basically. You know, I think it began with a certain observation on my part. Two things. One, the manner in which young people are desperate to belong to a peer group. There is this huge need to belong to a group. There is a obliterating need to be part of something bigger than they are, and in that sense to obliterate their own individuality. This boy unfortunately doesn't have that skill. He's good at everything else but that. Okay, and I've noticed that because I do a lot of work with young people, I noticed that the dysfunctional kids are the ones that interest me the most. So that was one. The second and more deeper psychological stimulus rather for this novel was the fact of illness. Because this is at one level about different kinds of illness. If you were to ask me what is this book about, I could very well say this is a book about sick people. And I don't mean only sick in the physical sense, but also psychologically sick. And I noticed that there were people around me who, despite success, despite overt attractiveness and confidence, were deeply suffering from something or the other. And I wanted to investigate what is it that causes, what is the link, the psychosomatic link between disease and our mental state. Because as I think, either was it Camus who said, when the heart is sad, the body languishes. And I'm very interested in the link between the body and the mind and how it manifests itself in illness. So these were the two primary stimuli to the book. You know, a lot of the books that I prefer have done precisely this, which is enter the psychology of the characters and indeed the psychology of the age, as it were. But I did that also in my first novel, which is called Rupture, also from HarperCollins. But there it was a very different set of characters. There were 9 characters in different cities. It was set over 24 hours and exploring what was happening to them internally, the unresolved issues of their past. So I've always been interested in the psychological side of human beings, because I think that's what makes us such a fascinating species. But I'm also attracted to that kind of novel. So I guess it's a coming together of my tastes as a reader and my predilections as a writer. No, that's a wonderful question, because it's actually the subtler kind that I'm interested in. Because on the surface, this group of attractive, confident, the boy is actually intimidated by them because he wants to be like them one day. But the truth is, when he enters their group and they start telling him about themselves, you realize that each of them has suffered from some kind of psychosis which has manifested itself in a physical way. So one of the characters, her name is Poka. She is a Bengali, as you might have guessed. All of them have the most bizarre nicknames, and one of them is called Poka. She suffered from panic attacks. Okay, looking at her, you'd never guess. So I'm very interested in the hidden and perhaps often secret manifestations of our psychological problems, because I think we're afraid to admit that we may have a psychological problem, and I'm always, in any case, interested in the subterranean level at which things happen. So it's a mixture of both, because Momo, the girl that he falls for, the protagonist, she is the only one, as we read the novel, she is the only one who is unafraid of letting her diseases manifest themselves in a way that almost seems exhibitionist, because she is not going to hide her diseases or pretend she doesn't have any. So it's a very interesting blend of people who would camouflage and people who would openly admit. You know, I haven't thought about that ever, because I don't think I've ever put this question to myself, but if I were to think it through, perhaps she is a counterpoint to the evasions, let's say, that the rest of the group is guilty of, because there is the leader of their group is a very apparently charming, very innocent looking, extremely intimidatingly well-read young man whose nickname is Baby. Okay, and in all their evasions and in the tricks that they play on this young boy who hero worships Baby, there is a sense of a kind of macabre, sinister power play. So maybe in my universe, in this universe, maybe Momo stands for a kind of innocence, in the sense that, maybe I have never thought about this, I'm retrospectively thinking about it, but perhaps, yes, perhaps she was, perhaps there's a moral comment somewhere there, though I may not have intended it at all, you know. Well, I think I read a lot about, this sounds really macabre, but I did read a lot about illnesses. But most of it was based on my observation of other people, and I'm delighted to say that this was ratified from a medical point of view when I had a conversation in Delhi with another writer who also happens to be a vascular surgeon, Ambarish Satwik. I was a bit terrified, because I was like, now this doctor is going to find that there are all these holes in my story. But on the contrary, he identified several of the syndromes, and he said this character exhibits this syndrome and that character has this particular problem. So for me it was wonderful to have that conversation, because I realized how much of what I had observed and transcribed through the fiction had a very strong and real root in medical history and medical science. So that was wonderful. You know, I think every novelist bases the creatures who populate his or her fiction on part reality and part where you take that reality. So I think a lot of them may have been, every character I would say is probably an amalgam of so many people I have known, including myself. So I wouldn't be able to say that, oh yeah, this person is based on that person exactly. That isn't what happens when your observations get refracted through the prism of fiction. But I would say, yeah, many of the things that my friends have suffered from find their way into the book, which is not to say that my friends are psychopaths, because some of the characters in this book are psychopaths. Lonely. When does that word become a boil on your chin that everyone can see? When does it get so bad people can smell it as you approach, alone and obvious? I carried it in my genes, the lonely chromosome. I inherited it with my only child status, my mother's ladla beta status, my reading pulp novels from the neighborhood library status. If only it had been boy genius lonely, expert hacker lonely, number nerd lonely. I was just plain vanilla lonely. Skulking at the fringes of playgrounds, what sort of boy are you? Lonely. Secretly, I dreamt of adulation. Mass adulation, people kissing my feet, fighting for a glimpse, a rock star of loneliness, a something sage, a guru of secret sorrows. I had read everything I could find, but what I found was not good enough. I had found blood and sex, murder and mortuaries, spy games and sci-fi. I gulped it all down, insatiable. And the greedier I got for the steamy, seamy stories, the lonelier I got. The more pulp I crammed into my brain, disguised from prying parental eyes, the less I cared for the world. I slid between the covers, a compulsive runaway. It made me what I am, lonely. It's not as if I hated it. I loved hated it. I fed it like a dog, snapping at my fingers, whining for scraps. I whipped it into a frenzy of loathing. People, I despised them. The silent loathing I filled myself with to defend myself must have seeped out of my pores and filled the air around me. People despised me. Worse, they ignored me. I was invisible with my precious, unnecessary hurt. No one had done me harm, everyone had. I longed for someone to dig at the scab and scar me, peel it away, let the ooze trickle out fresh again, heal me. Nobody had wanted to, and so I drifted on, lonely. Never ask a writer that, how much of me is that lonely fellow? I think every person who writes at core must be lonely, because that's the only way you can explain why anyone in their right mind would give himself or herself up to the absolute frightening solitude of being a writer. Because when you write novels, what does it mean? You're chained to this desk in a room filled with imaginary people, and you're doing it day after day after day after day after day. So it is something, there's something freaky and obsessive about it, and I think you can't do that unless somewhere in you there is this, maybe it's not loneliness, maybe it's a capacity for being alone. So I would say that's where I would find a kinship to the boy, but who knows, maybe other people can read it better than I myself.